this podcast, Drew Conway from Alluvium. In this podcast, Drew Conway from Alluvium talks about his journey creating an IoT data analytics startup in an industrial space. So stay tuned. So welcome everyone to another episode of Future of Data podcast. Today we have with us Drew Conway, and as you all recall, it's a second session with Drew. And in our previous conversation, we talked about the social aspect of data science, the how to build up a kind of social responsibility group, and how to sort of create a very good strategy and culture within an organization to create a connected data science society. So today we are off to another interesting journey with Drew, and that's his entrepreneurial stint on his IoT startup. So for everyone joining for the first time, here's a brief bio on Drew. So Drew is a CEO and founder of Alluvium. He's a leading expert in application of computation methods to social and behavioral problems at large scale. Drew has been writing, speaking about the roles of data and the discipline of data science in industry, government, and academia for several years. Drew has advised and consulted companies across many industries, ranging from fledgling startups to Fortune 100 companies, as well as academic institutions and government agencies at all levels. Drew started his career as a counter-terrorism as a computational social scientist in US intelligence community. So Drew, welcome to the podcast.
Great, it's good to be back.
Beautiful. So I think last time I was trying to connect the dots. Counter-terrorism to IoT startup.
Right.
Can you bridge that gap for us?
Yeah. I know at first blush it probably seems like a long walk around, but I promise there is a through line. And so just to talk a little bit about kind of where I started. So, as you mentioned in the bio, I started my career as a computational social scientist in the U.S. intelligence community. I suspect very strongly that the people who have the same job that I did 15 years ago are probably called data scientists. But the term didn't exist then, the career path didn't exist then, and what I was recruited into the community to think about was, how do you use the tools of math and computer science and statistics to build things that could help men and women out in the field make better decisions from data. All right, and so thinking about the time frame of when I was working in the Intel community, there was a heavy focus on the conflict theaters in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And so we had what I would call very rich information environments in those areas. We had space-based assets, what was called measurement intelligence, so ground sensors and mobile sensors. You had signals intelligence, so things like telecommunications, and then you had very unstructured information, written reports from someone from the field, a field commander, or even a private who was observing stuff. And so we would have this kind of constant cycle of trying to think about how to help people who are out in the field having to make really specific kinds of choices. So things like, if I go knock on this door, am I going to find the person I'm looking for? If we go walk down this street, is it going to be safe? And we had to think about building, either kind of custom integrated software tools or even simple methods, processes for working through that data that would help that person make that choice. And so having kind of started my career in that world, and quite frankly cutting my teeth on the technology stack that we often think about as kind of the commodity big data stack, things like Hadoop and open source scientific computing languages and platforms were still relatively new. And as you can imagine, working in government, which is always a little bit behind the curve technology wise, it was a challenge to get some of those technologies even to be in-house, but we were able to do that. And so ultimately when I left that career, the thing that I was really most the thing that I had learned above all else was this idea of how to build products for data analysis that actually help people in their job, like whatever the specific job is that they're doing. Technology for technology's sake is great if you're a researcher, but if you're actually building products for people, you want to think about how a particular application, solution, or even method fits into the work that they're already doing. And so, fast forward through a lot of my career, I know we covered DataKind in the last session, but basically everything that I've done since leaving DC has had a flavor of how do you build sort of data-driven products to help people who have to make decisions from data under heavy constraint, right? Under some constraint, whether that constraint is a budgetary constraint, it's a technology constraint, it's a time constraint, or any combination of those things. That's what's always really interested me. So fast forward to Alluvium. When I started thinking about founding the company, I had the very fresh memory in my head of the startup that I had just been at that had failed prior to founding it. So I was at a startup here in New York City that was called SUM, SUM, and what we were doing is thinking about building a consumer health product, actually both a hardware and software product. So this was an attempt to kind of move the ball forward on wearables, but really have a specific focus on data. And so the central idea was, if you could stream real-time physiological and telemetry data from someone using a worn wearable, how could you use all that information to tell them more about themselves than just the number of steps that they took or the number of calories that they burned, but rather try to connect a multidimensional view of health to be able to answer things like, well, if you do take this many steps and you do have a heart rate of X, how does that affect your sleep? Or how does some combination of exercise and eating affect your general mood and things like that? Really trying to have this kind of whole health view. And the thing there I was trying to do, which kind of carries through this, is think about supporting a person who wants to make health decisions for themselves based on this information, with a constraint being time and focus, and obviously doing analysis on their own data. Unfortunately, when that company was unsuccessful, I kind of walked away from it with two realizations. One, that the technology that we had been thinking about with respect to doing the kind of data analysis, and in particular there was a kind of focus on this dimensionality reduction problem of all these different inputs. It was, how do you do distributed learning from many different sensors out in the real world? There was some real interesting work that unfortunately we were no longer going to be able to do because of the consequences of that business. But the other thing that I learned was that even if we had done a really great job of solving that problem, let's just imagine that we had built the sort of perfect technology platform and we had an amazing product team. So I know that the consumer product would have been great. I think the consumer IoT market, certainly back in 2015, and I would make the argument that even still today, is very, very immature. Particularly with respect to, what does a consumer actually want to get out of the data that these devices are producing? I think beyond the sort of novelty of knowing things like step counts, or even, things like a connected home or value inside of some of those things, but not something that kind of provides a core business proposition. And so as I walked away from that and started doing some research and going out in the world and meeting folks from different parts of the sort of broader IoT space, what became clear is that the industrial space, so kind of industrial IoT, was a place where they did not have any of the problems that the consumer space had with respect to kind of data generation, data collection, certainly with respect to business problems, well-articulated business problems, and value. And so the kind of spark for Alluvium and the journey to building the company was, a long career in thinking about building products to help people, and then the eventual realization that the kinds of technology problems that I've become interested in over the course of the last 4 or 5 years were best suited to solve problems for people who were working in these industries. And as I said, those two ideas kind of came together, and that was really the spark for the company.
Interesting. So I think so. What you were saying is about sensory data and then utilizing that to provide analysis. The first thing that comes to mind is health. Like health is primarily, and you're talking about even like some of the health stats that. So, what made you think of industrial sector as your first line of attack when it comes to sort of this particular capability? We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.com .tao.ai and find your next dream job? Let's get back to the podcast.
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's probably, there's sort of a practical answer to that, and partly a personal one. The personal one is that, quite frankly, I'd been burned a little bit from the previous startup where we were focusing on healthcare and consumer healthcare, and so I think I was a bit cynical about the opportunity that would be there, and I would certainly agree that there's a tremendous amount of opportunity there, but I think the market, the regulatory regime, and the access to data make it very hard for someone like me who really wants to think about building, technology products from data inside of that. So it was not something that I decided to pursue. And then on the other side, the practical side is that the industrial space doesn't really suffer from any of those problems and has tremendously, granular data generation. If you just think about, you could sort of name your process or your industry there, whether it's in the energy industry, in manufacturing, in logistics. All of these industries are highly sophisticated and getting more sophisticated with respect to how they generate data. But the gap between that data acquisition and sophistication of process, and I think what, particularly at the time, kind of incumbent software providers were doing around analytics seemed to be getting broader and broader. And so, as an entrepreneur, I think you always think about, well, what is the shortest path to product market fit, or where are the real problems that need solving, that, and the sort of opportunity space. And that was the bet that I made, was that essentially we would want to focus on these industries where they sort of had these multiple dimensions of opportunity.
Interesting. Couldn't agree more. I think that's right. Nicely said. So now let's talk about, as an entrepreneur, what it is like to have an IoT startup. Like some of the challenges that you are seeing currently and that you have seen as you are brewing it up.
So, yeah, I mean, a great question. Lots of ways to think about attacking this. I think on the challenges side, there's sort of roughly three categories of challenges. We start with the product, right? So for us, I think one of the things that's really important when you want to go ahead and obviously start a company, and then the next step is build a product, or you have an idea around a product and build a company, is what is that kind of narrow focus of product that you can build that keeps you kind of moving forward. And the example that I always like to give is, or I guess the reference really is not on the entrepreneurial side, on the academic side. So when I was in my PhD, we would have discussions about deciding what were you going to do for your dissertation. And probably the most influential piece of advice I got was from a professor at NYU who was standing in front of a big whiteboard, and he took a marker out and he drew a huge circle, like as big of a circle as he could draw on the whiteboard, and he said, this is the entire space in which you could, of problems that you could try to address. And then he took that marker, put it down, and got a really fine tip marker, and he put a little dot, and he said, this is an area that you can focus on. He put a little dot there, and then he drew as tight a circle around that dot as you could focus. And he said, if you can expand everyone's knowledge of that problem by this much, you'll be a very successful, and you'll have a successful dissertation. And I think that's exactly true of product development, right? Particularly, tech and entrepreneurs, you think about really focusing in. And so, right off the bat for us, challenges were, how many problems do we want to try and solve? In the IoT, there's an obvious problem of hardware. Do you want to build your own hardware? Well, that was an easy one for me. No, I don't have any knowledge of that. I don't have any comparative advantage in thinking about doing that, and I have my own opinions about whether there's even a lot of comparative advantage for anyone to think about doing that. Do we want to build, general purpose analytics platforms, or do we want to build products? For me, it was, let's focus on a specific set of products. Let's not try to compete with platforms, and let's try to work ourselves. And really, the context of all these things is, building a product from the position of strength that you have as a team, and figuring out what the shortest path is to that. And even in that, I mean, certainly we had to work our way through some of that, and we can talk about that as well. But even initially, just thinking about, what are the things that we do well? What are the ideas that we have that are unique, and what is our point of view on building that stuff? That's a big one. I think the second one is obviously around kind of the market and what parts of the market do you want to interact with. You say
Mm,
IoT, that's a huge
mm,
space. You
mm,
say industrial IoT, that's a smaller but very, very big
mm,
space. And then even within that, there are many different industrial
mm,
verticals, and you can get really specific on one. Uh, so part of that is just going out and learning, if you figure out that first step in terms of product focus, where is that point of view on using, say, machine learning going to have the biggest value. And that is a process of for us, because me personally and nobody else who was there in the beginning of starting the company really had any deep subject matter expertise on the industrials market. And so we had to, by force of personality and kind of entrepreneurial guerrilla warfare, get out there and try to learn that answer, and ask people, go get meetings that we didn't deserve to get, and interview folks that were willing to spend time with us, and kind of start to whittle down on a focus area, which ultimately for us has become kind of process manufacturing, continuous automation systems in both the energy and material manufacturing and chemicals industry. But that was a journey, right? And that's
mm,
been a challenge. And then the third challenge, which every startup, every entrepreneur faces, is a competitive one. How do
mm,
you differentiate yourself within the market? What are the things about the first two, your product perspective and the market that you're going after, that makes you stand out in any market? And obviously the IoT market is immature
mm,
to a certain extent. The industrial IoT market, I think, is maybe even a little is certainly immature, but it's very competitive now, and it's
mm,
competitive on many dimensions. It's competitive on a dimension of incumbent platforms versus new technology platforms. It's competitive on a products versus services dimension. Companies that, like us, that build products versus companies that provide product driven services. And the end customers of these are also very new to the market, because the market hasn't existed for a very long time. And so most of the folks who are out there, who are potential buyers, some of them have very little context for what they're doing. And in fact, what's
mm,
useful for me is, because I've had the opportunity to work across different industries as they kind of grow into data science and machine learning as a discipline, as a sort of business discipline. I can kind of see where the energy industry is making some of the same mistakes that the advertising and media industry made 10 years ago. And so thinking about how are they, for example, thinking about this question of how much of this problem do we want to solve by working with a vendor versus how much of
mm.
this problem do we think we can solve internally. uh, and so I think those three areas are the biggest challenges, and they're certainly not unique to us and not unique to the IoT, but there's very specific parts of them that we think about.
We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast. Interesting. So it's funny, like, so when you were describing your, and by the way, thank you so much for going over
Mhm.
that. It recalled me, like I was recalling one of the conversation I had with one of the hydroelectric power plant manufacturer. So I went to one of their sites, and I was talking about this idea of consolidating their data, so they can capture more information and they can optimize, and they can try to figure out the failure rates even before they occur, and all that good stuff. And he showed me one
Mhm.
thing. So he said, Vishal, let's look at that particular small boiler, and said, let me put that boiler number in my inventory list. And there comes about, I think, about 170 parts that this boiler is using, and then each part is made by some manufacturer, and
Mm.
they're all put together and banded together to make it work. So he said that my paranoia, as an entrepreneur, or as a leader in this
Right.
organization, is what. So every vendor is different. It's so scattered around, of all, like all these gadgets come with their own sort of nuances, and they don't often talk to each other.
Right.
And now you're talking to me about getting the data feed and
Mm.
capturing all doing that. So he said that whenever I go to these interesting startup communities, and I see this beautiful, amazing companies that can really, it brings tears to my eyes at what it could do, what it could do to my company, but I can't freaking move an inch on that because of
Right.
this vendor limitation. What would you say to that guy? What would you say to that particular executive that who's on the fence of, hey, maybe I'll not be able to penetrate this?
Yeah, and that specific scenario is something that we run into frequently, and
Hmm.
I think part of it is there's a curve of adoption around either cloud migration within companies or better underlying infrastructure and better tools for being able to connect that's happening. But for many companies, it's not, and you know. For us, we focus on a part of the market where that barrier to entry is a little lower, right? So
Hmm.
if they're, we work with companies where, there's sort of a bare minimum to working with Alluvium where, you have to be able to get data out of your system. And,
Hmm.
if you can't get data out of your system, then,
Hmm.
we're not the infrastructure providers.
Hmm.
We're not the hardware providers.
Hmm.
And I think, if 2 years ago, if you imagine a kind of normally distributed sort of sophistication metric, technical sophistication metric over our customers, maybe we were dealing mostly with the 80th percentile. Now,
Hmm.
2018, we're probably dealing more with like the 50th percentile of having access, and that line is constantly moving back. But to really kind of think more specifically about this question, the easiest way to show value is to talk to a customer about like what is the one problem that you wish you could solve, and you
Hmm.
mentioned one that comes up a lot, which is this idea of sort of predictive maintenance.
Hmm.
And for almost any company that we would talk to, and power generation is actually a space that we worked in, there will be an incident or some series of incidents that have caused that organization a lot of pain. And I'm talking
Hmm.
about, either the top three super majors in the oil and gas industry down to a locally administered power plant.
Hmm.
Every single one of those companies will have something that really hurt them, economically,
Hmm.
internally, or literally, was a catastrophic incident that had real loss associated with it.
Hmm.
And if you can say, well, let's use that as a test, because everybody here sitting around the table knows exactly what's going to happen here. And if our tool can show you something that you didn't know, or show you how it would have gotten you to a better or safer outcome, then in some sense the technology will sell itself, right? You'll be able to, because everybody knows this situation, and so starting folks from a position of, well, what's the thing that really hurt you in the
Hmm.
past,
Hmm.
and is that something that you want to try and prevent in the future? That's a great place to start. And then, then the rest of it kind of fits into, well, how would this tool have actually fixed it in the situation that we're working on? And again, from a product development perspective, that's a constant
Hmm.
flow of, product development, feature prioritization to be able to integrate into a workflow of a customer, set of customers, without having to dramatically alter their day to day. Because at the end of the, in the end, that is the poison pill, right, for new
Hmm.
technology. If there's too much expectation of changing the way someone works, in some fundamental way, it's going to be incredibly challenging to fix that. And that is very true in the industrial space, where you're dealing with the history. I think oftentimes we're very biased in the software industry, because our workflows will change very rapidly. Think about it. It wasn't that long. GitHub seems like it's second nature, but I remember,
Hmm.
when I graduated college, nobody used GitHub, and now
Hmm.
it's second nature. And so these things change very quickly. In the industrial space, they have hundreds of years of history of how they do work. Many of those things have not changed, and so you have to have a lot of respect for that and a lot of humility for that when you build these products.
Interesting. And one more thing that I was thinking about is that's associated with analytics is automation.
Hmm.
And the moment you talk about automation in industrial settings, so there's another sort of there's a paranoia about
Mm.
automation in many aspects, right? Because many of these industries are run by unionized labor workers and what and whatnot. So we get into this area of so it and I surprisingly find myself into a lot of this conversation, which is I don't know if rightly so or wrongly so, that analytics somehow means automation in some aspect. So probably my leadership won't entertain that, or at least it'll be dissed off.
Hmm.
What has been your experience from your vantage point as an entrepreneur, trying to sort of reach out to
Yeah.
these businesses?
Well, our experience and our observation has been almost identical. I think they're rightfully so a lot of FUD, fear, uncertainty,
Mm,
and doubt
mm,
associated with anything that has a flavor or presents as automation, both mechanically or in software. Uh, and I think more specifically, anything that has automation related to decision making
mm,
for either operators or analysts is met with a high degree of skepticism and recalcitrance, mostly because if you think about the history of the industrial space going back a few decades, you know, there is a long history of failure, right? Going
mm,
back to expert knowledge systems, to the AI winter, to more recent approaches with large software companies building kind of black magic tools. These folks have experienced a lot, and they know that unless they can kind of open up what's going on inside these systems, they won't trust them. And in the downstream oil and gas space, in refineries, there's a sort of mantra of what's called trust but verify. Right.
mm,
So, and this would, hey, say, having nothing to do with software. If you're an operator in a refinery, that tool might be a gauge on the wall, has a number on it, and you have no reason not to trust that, but you verify. Trust
mm,
but verify. And for us, we've thought a lot about both in terms of the engagement we have with our customers and the way that we build products is kind of circling around this idea of trust but verify.
mm,
When you build we use many different kind of machine learning and AI techniques in what we do, but the product should always be able to expose to the operator a sense of why the system made a choice, and more
mm,
importantly, allow for that operator to evaluate that choice that the system made and improve it. In
mm,
our kind of flagship product, which is called Alluvium Primer, the general the primary user for that is someone who's managing resources in an industrial operation. Either a plant
mm,
manager, a senior industrial engineer, someone whose job has a regular cadence of having to know, okay, I show up to work at 7 o'clock in the morning. I need to understand what happened the night before. And what they can use Primer to do is consolidate that information or that data that was generated overnight, and then in an automated way, allow for a prioritized list of things that are essentially suggestions that they should be paying attention to. This part
mm,
of the compressor looks like it's a little wobbly today. This set of data is unstable, as we would say. It is unstable as with respect to how it usually looks. But it doesn't change how they do their job, because they're
mm,
still going to run stand up. They're still going to marshal resources around this. But what it does is it just makes that process more efficient and allows for them to tell the system when it's wrong. Also allows for them to tell the system when they're right. And so when they
mm,
show up the next day, they have an expectation that the system will be a little bit smarter. It'll know a little bit more about their particular use case. And that is essentially, well, it's two things. Sociologically, it's a trust building exercise, right?
mm,
It is a sort of programmatic trust building exercise in the product. But then algorithmically, it's feature engineering, right? we're
mm,
we're leveraging the expertise and knowledge of that industrial engineer, so that the system now goes from a, say, fully unsupervised way of analyzing data to a semi-supervised one, and then goes forward iteratively from there. And so the customer or the user never has to know that. In fact, they're kind of a passive feature engineer in the process,
mm.
but they work a little bit better.
Okay. We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast. Interesting. So, I think interesting point. So, I was thinking about, from your perspective, what is an IoT ready company? So like, if like any
Mm.
company that deals with you, right, they should know some nuances of what you're supposed to deliver or value on. So what do you say if I'm an industrialist trying to understand that, I want to use my data to help me minimize my losses and maximize my productivity. So, what do you call, from your vantage point, an IoT ready company that I'm qualified? I should talk to you.
Right. Um, the answer may be somewhat counterintuitive because I think
Mm,
you might start from a position of saying, well, it's a technology problem.
mm,
Have you instrumented this operation? Are your employees uh, kind of software competent in a sense that software is a big part of their job?
mm,
I actually think that sort of neither of those are primary challenges to being an IoT ready or say ready to work with Alluvium.
mm,
Um, because the reality is there isn't an industrial vertical that isn't a data driven business and hasn't been a data driven business probably for the last several decades. So
mm,
that part we can kind of put to the side. There can be a fair amount of discussion around the level of sophistication there, but let's just put
mm,
that to the side. The individuals working in those businesses, whether they're operators managing facilities and resources, or folks on the IT side and the support staff, they're incredibly sophisticated as well, and they have deep subject matter expertise in their areas. I think to be IoT ready or to work with us, you have to have a well articulated problem to solve. And
mm,
so we think about, the low hanging fruit or whatever your metaphor is. I think I like to extend that metaphor to include this notion of like, well, whatever a piece of that hanging fruit is kind of heaviest with data and value to you as a business, then if you have that, you're ready. Because if you have a problem that you want solved, you say, okay, I know that if this particular asset or this operation, if we can reduce downtime by 30%, I'll save X millions of dollars. If you've already done that calculation, and the vast majority of these companies know that to the penny, right? They know exactly how much a downtime incident will cost them. And if they've connected that to data that they're already very likely collecting, well, then 80% of the challenge is finished. Now the question is, what is the best way to actually leverage that data, and what is the best product to help improve the operator's workflow to
mm.
prevent that from happening? And then that's for us. That's the pitch, right? Is Alluvium the best product to solve that problem for us, or is it somebody else? And that's our challenge to solve. But as a company, I think once you have answers to those questions, you're ready to enter the market, because even today there are broad perspectives on how to solve these problems.
Interesting. So now let's go a bit tactical on your journey. So
Hmm.
not getting into the names as such, but
Yeah.
in your experiences with businesses that you're working or serving right now, what are some of the challenges that you are seeing when it comes to integrating their industrial sort of setups with your tool? So what are some of the challenges that you see like that you can share?
Yeah, I think, from a technology point of view, there is a kind of there's a certain heterogeneity to platforms and where people have data. Yeah, and
Mm,
it's not that different from other industries. There's this
mm,
notion of siloing of data.
mm,
Most of these companies are large corporations, so there's a fair amount of institutional uh, set of barriers that exist between the folks who are actually doing the work in the field, who has access to what data, and then maybe who's a decision maker around deploying or building this stuff. That's not that's perennial, right? Especially
mm,
if you're building an enterprise business, those things are always exist, and they have particular set of foibles for industrial customers, as they would in any industry. um, I think the more kind of first order challenge or barrier is sort of our where are folks in terms of being convinced that these products actually have value. And by that I mean,
mm,
is machine learning something that can really add to my business?
mm,
As we were saying before, I mean, most of this has to do with, is a is a company in a position where they're sort of beyond the point of experimentation.
mm,
What we found I actually I've seen a real shift from 2017 to 2018, where in 2017 many companies were kind of just on the proof of concept
mm,
stage, where they were willing to experiment. They mostly wanted to do these experiments to prove internally that there was some there, but I don't
Hmm.
think they weren't really, quite frankly, they weren't buying a whole lot of stuff.
Hmm.
Um, and I think part of that has to do with their own institutional perspectives and how they like to roll things out. Part of it had to do with what they were hearing from their sort of long associated vendors, either the OEMs who were providing them infrastructure, or the kind of incumbent software providers who were saying, oh, no, we can do all this stuff. Don't worry about talking to those startups or those companies you've
Hmm.
never heard of. Uh, but now in 2018, I've seen a real shift. I think one of the things that has played to our advantage and probably to other startups kind of in our vicinity
Hmm.
is that most of the large industrial companies, I think, are beginning to shy away from only engaging with, say, large management consulting companies. There's a long tradition of kind of buying custom design software from the large management consulting companies to solve for a specific problem. But I think the leaders in the industrial space have kind of looked around at their peers in other industries and seen the value of buying, whether they're SaaS software products or on-prem deployed software products that solve one problem that has a lot of value for
Hmm.
them really well, and they can just have a subscription to it. That I think the sort of economics of that are pretty obvious, and they're beginning to move much more in a direction of that. And I think, of course, there's also been more of an internalization of data science as a discipline inside these
Hmm.
organizations. I think in 2017, it would have been pretty rare for me to meet or engage with someone at a potential customer who held the title of data science, and certainly
Hmm.
very rare for me to meet someone who was a
Hmm.
senior manager with the title of head of data science at X company. 2018, that's changing a lot. Whether it's more whole teams who are data science teams internally who kind of come with a perspective of and maybe are like us and actually are more formally trained data science folks and not industry experts, or actually companies who are out building management structures and whole centers of excellence throughout the data science. All of that, I think, has really moved the industry in a direction where whether it's Alluvium or other companies in the space, become much more palatable to begin working with us.
Interesting. And what has been your observation when it comes to data science talent pool that these companies have? Like, so do you find yourself in in the business of educating these businesses what to do with you, or do you find that these companies are proficient? Like typically nowadays in industrial manufacturing, or industrial companies are proficient enough with all these keywords and they know how to engage with you smartly.
Yeah, I actually think the comparison to healthcare, it's something that I was just down in Houston last week
Hmm.
at a machine learning and oil and gas conference, and so I was essentially having a sort of version of this conversation a few times with different people, and kind of thinking about how let's just say the energy industry in particular has begun to mature and move towards data science as a kind of standalone discipline.
Hmm.
Um, if I think about some of the challenges that existed in the healthcare space that I observed in part from the previous startup and then other opportunities and exposure to it, there there's there's kind of the language problem, which is are we attempting to solve the same problem with a different set of tools, but to the same end? And
Hmm.
so one person's um, you know uh, set of linear models is another person's decision tree
Hmm.
or random forest. And so how do we kind of
Hmm.
combine those or overlap those so people understand them? And then there's just a bias of method. And so I think the interesting thing in healthcare is there's a long tradition of kind of understanding how biological systems work and computational biologists approaching these things with known formulas, known approaches so about these biological systems. But what machine learning knows how to do is kind of take a bunch of data, particularly data that has labels that says, this person has some pathology and this person doesn't, and we can build up a model that represents how to predict for particular pathology without any of that context. I think it's hard for folks who have deep training using a specific set of tools to suddenly say like, oh, we're going to use this other thing that doesn't have all that context but works really well for certain sets of problems, and actually trust that. And in the industrial space, so particularly in the oil and gas space, if you think about a long tradition of physics-based modeling, geologic modeling, simulation, if you're gonna stick a hole in the ground, it's going to cost you a couple $100 million to do it. And you've done your simulation and your modeling using a certain set of tools basically for the entire history of that business, and then suddenly someone comes along and says, listen, we would approach this problem in a slightly different way with more abstract approaches to it, not having the context for the physics, but it performs really, really well, in some cases better for some sets and some classes of problems. There's a lot of friction there. And so, I think for the industrial space, and not to pick on oil and gas, I think this is true for lots of different kinds of industries, there's that barrier of, are we building a data science team internally and effectively trying to convert folks who used to have titles of, well site engineer or SCADA analyst, and now we're calling them data scientists because we're going to slap a Jupyter notebook in front of them and they're going to start doing work differently? Or are we going to build an internal team from folks who maybe have little to no knowledge of the particular industry that we work on, but are really well suited to think about the sort of statistical and technical approaches to that? And of course, the answer, as you can probably guess, is you're going to probably do both, right? Because these companies need to work as teams, and then hopefully for our sake and other companies, there's obviously there's a role for outside vendors to come in who have specific tools that can support these folks, and it's going to be a kind of team sport, as DJ Patil would say.
Right, interesting. And now, from your entrepreneurial sort of vantage point, if you look at these industries, and they're sort of creating this, sort of adopting this IoT related capabilities, what are some of the challenges that you are seeing these businesses going through when it comes to adopting these IoT capable sort of models and technologies and capabilities? What are some of that you can sort of suggest or say?
Yeah, so I think adoption is, it's sort of the classic business problem, which is, where is the seed of adoption coming from? Is it coming top down? And so is this an initiative that's driven by an executive level choice of direction to say, we are now going to use IoT as a way of achieving X sets of goals? Or is it more of a bottom up thing where, folks are kind of looking around and saying, we have some, to use my example, we have some really well-defined business problems, and we, the men and women who I met last week in Houston at this conference, they're working in these oil and gas companies. They say, listen, we just went to a conference and we saw a bunch of examples of how this could work for us, and we think it matches our problem set as well, and do we bring it in? I think there's challenges in both directions, right? So what we've seen is that if a company has a kind of executive mandate, a typical path that they will take to try to adoption is okay, well, we're going to stick some resources in a group. We're going to do a reorg, right? Because that's what big corporations do really well. So we're going to do this reorg, and we're going to say, okay, we have this kind of center of innovation, or they probably already have an innovation center, and now we're going to dedicate some resources to Industry 4.0 IoT. And then there's people in that business people within that business unit or that part of the organization that now go out in the market and they email people like me and they say, hey, we've heard some great things about Alluvium. We'd love to chat to see what you're doing. And from the entrepreneur's perspective, my experience with those folks is that they're really good at wasting your time, but they're not super good at connecting you to real business problems because they don't own any of them. Right? They don't, and in some cases for folks where I've had better experiences, maybe they actually know specifically, a senior person at a business unit who has told them, hey, this is a problem that we need solved, but there's still a long path between that and budget and, getting something executed. So, the top-down approach, I think it's a little bit sometimes is a little bit too circuitous to actually get to the business
Mm.
problem. And probably, as you can imagine, the sort of inverse problem exists when you go bottom up. So
Mm.
if it's someone who's, if it's an individual sitting on a team who says, "Hey, I'd love to try this technology," they talk to their boss and they say, I was at this conference and I heard Drew Conway speaking, and product seems really interesting. We'd love to maybe try it. Well, if there is no corporate
Mm.
engagement going up, then
Mm.
it's challenging for that person to kind of move beyond that kind of small POC experiment. And so, you kind
Mm.
of get in this cycle. And, from an entrepreneur's perspective, you have to get really, really sharp at qualifying your customers. Like, do they have the features of a customer that is actually ready to move beyond just a proof of concept or a trial, right? And for us, there's some basic technical stuff. Do you have data? Can you get that data to us into our product? But there's a big part of that that's timing, right? It's like, are you
Mm.
actually going to start a trial? Are you gonna light up a subscription this quarter? Right? Is this an immediate need for you? Have as I was saying before, have you
Mm.
felt a pain strong enough that you're willing to actually do something? And then we even have more specific stuff around, is there someone at the organization who is kind of the budget authority, right? Someone
Mm.
who can sign up that, but and that's pretty basic. But then, is there someone who's kind of the data authority? Is there someone that we can go to who we know is able to unlock this information and get it to us? And there's if we have this pathway, this kind of decision tree, then we say, okay, we've qualified a customer. But
Mm.
many customers fall out of that, and again, that's part of that distribution that I mentioned before. Is like, it used to be that lots of customers were falling out of that because we just couldn't find those people yet. But now, as the calendar has turned to 2018, I think there's been a change where we're able to work with more companies, get them through that process.
Interesting. So now let's focus a few minutes on your startup. And you as an entrepreneur in
Mm.
that. So in your experience so far, getting into Alluvium versus now at Alluvium. So what have you seen about the industry and your startup's interaction with it?
So I think we have a very specific point of view on what the
Mm.
value of advanced analytics, machine learning, AI, whatever you
Mm.
want to call it,
Mm.
has. And so my experience has been the challenge is kind of moving from this abstract notion, and for us, I sort of mentioned it briefly, we think the real value for a man or a woman whose primary job it is to kind of understand and have situational awareness around some complex continuous automation system. Their real challenge is this, is actually being able to like compute on all this data at any given moment and then make a decision from it. The way that I often talk about it is there's this sort of natural tension that exists in any problem where there's asymmetry between data and decision
Mm.
maker. Is
Mm.
you could either dedicate resources to discovering novelty in that data. So there's like, they'll have this ocean of data, or I have this big data lake, or whatever you like. And every day or all the time during the day, I have to be able to pull out the nuggets from that actually have
Mm.
real information in them. And so you could dedicate a lot of resources to thinking about solving that problem. You could be a person or a team of people who literally have to think about that all the time. But then there's the other side of that problem, the other side of the tension, which is reasoning about what that change actually means and then making decisions from it, right? And so if we think about what we think about at Alluvium is, how do we build products that kind of ease the tension in the direction of reasoning away from
Mm.
having to do this discovery process all the time? Because a well-designed learning system should be able to ferret out all of the nuggets, or at least most of the nuggets, with high confidence based on all of these input data, because that's what a machine comparative advantage is, right? That's a machine can scale that kind of learning very easily where a person can't.
Mm.
But a machine is terrible at reasoning about it, right? Particularly if you think about it in unsupervised context. Like, a machine has no context
Mm.
for what that change means, but person, particularly a person who has deep industry knowledge and subject matter expertise on these things, can do that very quickly. And so how we have attempted to kind of differentiate ourselves is by leaning in really heavily on this idea of provide a system that distills this information down to a single set of metrics, which what we would call a stability score. operation of any complex system, and using that stability score to build products that allow for the rapid evaluation of what any specific novel finding or change in that system looks like. And so with Alluvium Primer, as I mentioned before, the approach then is how do we take all of this data, all this heterogeneous data from a platform. So, staying with the
Mm.
refinery example, how do we take all this pressure data, this thermal data, information from the compressor, information on power generation, flow, all this information, all of which an operator would have access to, but none of which then any individual operator, even a well-trained team, is going to be able to observe all the time at any day. Build a system that can learn from that data in an unsupervised way to provide back to those operators a simple index that when it changes, particularly when it changes in some systematic way, provides an alert, provides a reference that
Mm.
operator can then look at and then very quickly evaluate and say, yep, that's something important. We need to dedicate resources to go figuring out what that is. Or, you know what, that's not important. Either it's a false positive or it's something that
Mm.
we know is going to happen, and then that interaction allows the system to get smarter, right? It's like
Interesting.
that's kind of the breadth of it. And so if you do something really specific like that and solve a real person's problem without trying to do too much, we've had success kind of pointing in that direction.
Interesting. And so when you start something like Alluvium, when you start a startup in IoT space, you can attack pretty much every goddamn use cases under the sun, right? So how do you pick your favorites? How do you pick your first few that you think that you're gonna base your startup on?
I think it's this again. This is true of every startup. There's this kind of you have to experiment and cycle and find this equilibrium point between whatever your particular point of view or comparative advantage is as a technology builder and
Mm.
what the real problem is or the specific problem is that you can as quickly as possible discover in the market, or maybe you have your own unique perspective because you come from that market as an
Mm.
entrepreneur to try to solve, right? And I think the rare case is when you have someone who comes from a particular market, has deep subject matter expertise, kind of knows the problems really well, and then also is really, really well equipped to solve that problem technically. That's why I see many successful startups will have a balance of founders where you probably have both and they can work together. In our case, I had a pretty specific point of view on what I thought the value of machine learning would be. Again, it was kind of focusing on this, for lack of a better term, kind of dimensionality reduction
Mm.
problem.
Mm.
And then we, as quickly as we could, and certainly I wish we had done it faster, because the one thing that you always have against you in a startup is time.
Mm. Mm.
Getting to a specific problem that we could solve, and really a specific person that we could solve it for, being able to understand what the size of the market was around those people, and then convincing investors and customers that there was real value creation to be made there, and then just like heads down build it.
Interesting. So if I am a startup trying to build an IoT startup, who are the sort of warm bodies I could pitch, who I could bring, or who could actually back a startup like me? Like, do you have any perspective on fellow entrepreneurs who are trying to sell their product and they want to get their POCs out? Who are the right candidate that they could talk to?
In terms of what types of customers should they be
Yeah.
looking for?
Yeah.
So, this is going to vary, I think, based on industry. So we
Mm.
probably have the most experience in the oil and gas space, particularly on the downstream side. So I can speak to that a
Mm.
little bit. And
Mm.
this is likely true of most cases. So let's just talk. I'm going to say specifically on the enterprise side because that's the side that I know. So, an enterprise industrial IoT, it's a very top-heavy set of industries, right? So,
Mm.
most of the companies are in the Fortune 500 or 100, large, massive organizations, and so the advice that I would give is, if there's a problem that you can solve that is sort of universally felt, not just at the top, but also at the middle and potentially smaller players within that industry, you'll always have a shorter path to success if you're not working with one of the big major
Hmm.
majors. And unfortunately, in the industrial space, you talk about this idea of like whale hunting. You're going for the
Hmm.
big companies, and it's always challenging to do that. And on the industrial side, most of the companies are whales, because it's just
Hmm.
the economies of scale there are pretty asymmetrical, and so most of the companies are whales. But there are degrees of whales, right? There's like
Hmm.
there's the blue whales, and then there's the beluga whales. And
Hmm.
so what we have found is that if you can find that equilibrium, or that optimal point where the company has not yet dedicated internal resources to solving the problem, or even problems adjacent to it, you will bypass this kind of constant problem of, should we buy this, or should we build it internally? Because the
Hmm.
top heavy the big blue whales in this discussion are always going to think about solving the problem themselves. Partly because of
Right.
the
Right.
resources that they have, and I think partly because of, quite frankly, um, you know, ego, or they're very successful, so they've been successful. They believe they can continue to be successful, uh, and so I think that the warm bodies, as you say, are the ones that are under the most constraint, that are
Hmm.
most resource constrained, most time constrained, and so you always have a shorter path there. And that's certainly been our experience, and I think it's probably true, in most enterprise businesses, but certainly those that try to sell to industrials.
Interesting. So, in your journey so far, so like if we say, and we're almost at the end of the conversation. So,
Mhm.
Drew, and thank you so much for being very candid on that. So, what is one thing that you are surprisingly like? One of the thought that is your assumption that bursted. So,
Mhm.
what do you call that when you venture into something like Alluvium and standing now today? Some of the assumptions that weren't true or has changed.
Yeah, so I think we I had one really strong product assumption that was basically totally wrong. And so when I first started the company, and again, thinking about this sort of technical perspective of dimensionality reduction,
Hmm.
my idea was, well, if I think about all the constituents in a typical industrial company, and we kind of break these up into three pieces. So there's the person who's standing inside the operation, right? So there's that man or that woman who's standing on the refinery platform. Their biggest challenge is one of kind of time compression. How do I get to an answer as quickly as possible? Because the thing that I'm most challenged by is my ability to kind of compute on all this data very quickly, and then take an action so I can prevent some bad thing from happening, right? My perspective was, that is the core constituency that we want to focus on. We want to be able to deploy software inside the refinery or inside the
Hmm.
facility, so that we can do this kind of real time, what they would call edge analytics, right? The term of art that exists in the IoT
Hmm.
is edge
Right.
analytics. And we spent a lot of time, the better part of the first year of the company's life, really focusing on trying to not only build that product, but also sell or get POCs in that direction. And it took me a long time to really hear the feedback that we were getting from the market, which was, in one direction, really love the idea, the approach of this stability score, and this ability to have kind of situational awareness at a high level. But the institutional barriers to entry for actually getting software deployed inside those facilities was much higher than I had ever anticipated. And that's speaking from
Hmm.
someone who used to work, in arguably the largest bureaucracy on planet Earth, the Department of
Hmm.
Defense. So it took me a long time to kind of listen to the customer, or too long, or longer than should have. Listen to the customer, take a seat back, and said, what is the problem that we can solve where that barrier doesn't exist? And without going
Hmm.
into the whole story, eventually that becomes primer. We build a product around a problem where we can solve for this, that where we don't have to be deployed inside the facility, and we can either do it in a cloud hosted platform, or we can host on prem. Uh, that was by far the biggest challenge. And there are other mistakes that we made in kind of focusing spending too much time with the wrong customers, or not necessarily hiring for the right sets of competencies because we were chasing after the wrong technical approach. But again, those things always happen, and you always wish you always look back and wish you could have solved for them faster. But that's kind of the name of the game. I think the number one for us was we just misestimated our entry point.
Awesome. So I think that's very. I think I share the something similar story as from my end as well. That one of the first assumption was colossally. It was like I couldn't even imagine why the world is not conforming around what I want to sell fast enough. So then, it's painfully long and painfully more expensive realization that maybe I think it's just your I think maybe entrepreneurial debt that you have to somehow pay before you get your ass whooped. So it's just
and in some sense, many companies their success is defined by leaders and teams that can redirect themselves in the right direction more quickly.
Right. Interesting. So with that, Drew, thank you so much for this amazing session. Before we part ways, I definitely want your closing perspective on an entrepreneur trying to build an IoT startup. What are some of the word of wisdom you could give to that guy or a gal?
Yeah. So, in some sense, the whole conversation has really kind of focused around this idea of, what is your comparative advantage, intellectually, experience-wise, or technically, and how can you use that to have a point of view that's going to solve a person's problem? I think the mistake that I see of many entrepreneurs make, and the mistake that I've made in my career, is we focus on the businesses, and we think of businesses or industries as these sort of monolithic, personified entities, but they're just collections of people. And to be successful, you have to have a person love your product, and then that person makes other people love your product, and your business grows. And so if you can focus on a person and then measure the size of an opportunity based on the number of those people who exist in an industry or in the market, and then go build that product that solves a problem for that person, you will be successful. Right? That is the path. You will convince investors, you will convince buyers, and you will be able to recruit a team, because nothing creates the kind of flywheel of success like people in the world using your product and getting value out of it. And so, be focused on the people who you serve.
Interesting. With that said, Drew, thank you so much for yet another interesting and amazing session. And I think it will be really useful for our listeners and viewers who are trying to build or grunt through this IoT startup in their journey. Really, really helpful. As I said, you're always welcome back on the podcast. Love to have you back in later part in your life to discuss Alluvium success and what you're doing. And with that, wish you nothing but success. And thank you so much again for this amazing session.
Well, thank you for having me. It was great, and we'll use that as a placeholder for the next. We'll talk about the success of Alluvium in the next session.
Awesome.
I thought I was sick of home, but actually I was homesick. Never really knew that I would have to grow up so quick. I'm so uncomfortable, don't know anybody here. Just a couple dudes that I met once, that's it. And I go into the booth feeling nervous. Got butterflies in my stomach like I'm so worthless. Is the mic on? I don't know how to work this. Inside I'm breaking down, I hope I'm not up on the